The scent of blood and fear still clung to the air, a perfume of victory that did little to soothe the cold fire in his gut. Eric stalked through the gates of the frozen court, his massive form casting a long, menacing shadow in the dying light, and the silence that fell before him was a weapon in itself. His elite guard, the Bloodclaws, flanked him, their black armor stained with the gore of the rogue pack they'd just annihilated. It wasn't a battle. It was an execution, a message, and he was the author. He swept into the great hall, a vast cavern of black stone and ancient glacier ice that seemed to drink the light from the roaring fires. The pack members gathered there bowed their heads, not in love, but in a perfect, beautiful terror. His terror. More importantly, his control. He ascended the dais and sank onto his throne, a monstrous thing carved from the heart of a frozen mountain, and the weight of his power settled back onto his shoulders like a familiar cloak. His beta Yorick approached the throne, bowing low. "A flawless victory, my king," Yorick said, his voice smooth as polished riverstone. "They never stood a chance." Eric's lip curled, his golden eyes fixed on his second-in-command. "They were weak. Vermin. Strength is the only law that matters, Yorick. You'd do well to remember that." He leaned forward, his voice a low growl that rumbled through the hall. "Your suggestion to parley with them, to offer terms, that was weakness." Yorick's gaze remained on the floor, but Eric saw the flicker of something in his eyes, a shadow of dissent, quickly masked. "Of course, Alpha. My only thought was to preserve our warriors for greater threats." "There are no greater threats," Eric declared, his voice booming. "Not for us. Not while I rule." He saw it then, the subtle clenching of Yorick's jaw. A lesser Alpha might have missed it, but Eric's missed nothing. To make things worse, he knew Yorick thought him a brute, a relic who relied on savagery instead of strategy. In fact, Yorick believed this because he was a creature of whispers and shadows, not of fang and claw. But then Yorick's expression softened into something that looked almost like genuine concern. "My king, forgive my forwardness, but there is another matter. A minor dispute on the southern ridge with the Moonstone Pack. They claim hunting rights to the Silver Creek." He paused. "And my sister, Ilara. Her sickness worsens. The healers say they need rare herbs that grow only in that territory. If you could persuade the Moonstone Alpha." Eric stared down at him. The plea was a clever one. It was beneath a king to settle such a petty squabble. But the appeal to his beta's family was a calculated move, a test of his compassion, a quality he had no time for. He wanted to refuse, to remind Yorick that personal sentiment was a disease. Even so, a king had to maintain the illusion of order. "Fine," Eric snapped, waving a dismissive hand. "I will ride to the ridge myself. I will remind this Moonstone Alpha who owns the creeks, the forests, and the very air they breathe." A demonstration of power was always useful. Yorick bowed again, lower this time. "Thank you, my king. You are merciful." The word felt like an insult. As Yorick retreated, Eric watched him go, a sliver of unease piercing his victory. He didn't trust Yorick's smooth words, he didn't trust his hidden glances, and he certainly didn't trust his sudden concern for a sister who had, by all accounts, been perfectly healthy a week ago.
Meanwhile, a world away, the forest floor was soft and damp beneath Lyra's worn boots. Here, there were no alphas, no courts, no judgment, only the quiet rustle of leaves and the patient hunt. Her breath plumed in the crisp air, a fleeting ghost, and she moved with a silence that was second nature. A predator in her own right, not by rank, but by necessity. She had learned to survive on the fringes of the human world, to suppress the omega wolf within her until it was nothing more than a faint, aching pulse beneath her skin. Without warning, a flicker of movement. A magnificent buck, its antlers like a crown of barren branches against the gray sky. Her heart gave a single, steady thump. Her bow came up, the string creaking softly. In that moment, she wasn't a rejected Omega. She was just the hunter. The arrow flew true, a whisper of death, and the buck fell. As she knelt beside the animal, her hands moving with practiced skill, her fingers brushed against something hard and cold in the moss. A charm. She picked it up. It was carved from dark wood, a tiny, snarling wolf, its details worn smooth by time. Maybe it was fate, but the moment her skin touched it, a memory, sharp and cruel, slammed into her. The great hall of the frozen court, the suffocating scent of power and pine, the crushing weight of hundreds of eyes on her. It was the claiming ceremony, the day her life had shattered. She had stepped forward, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, and offered herself to the Alpha King. And Eric's. He had looked through her. His golden eyes, cold as the glacier heart of his throne, had scanned her form with utter disinterest, with a casual dismissal that cut deeper than any claw. He hadn't just rejected her. He had erased her. A low-born Omega. Nothing. Less than nothing. The shame of it had been a physical blow, a brand seared onto her soul. Her breath caught in her throat now, the memory as raw as a fresh wound. She shoved the charm deep into her pocket, the wood digging into her palm. Deep down, she knew the truth. She had run from that world not just to survive, but to escape that feeling of worthlessness he had branded her with. That's why she lived alone. That's why she trusted no one. Because of that, she had built a life where no alpha could ever look at her and find her wanting again. But as she stood, the weight of the buck across her shoulders, the little wolf charm in her pocket felt impossibly heavy, like a stone pulling her back toward a past she could never truly outrun.
That night, the air on the southern ridge was sharp with the promise of snow. Eric's rode with only a handful of his blood claws, his impatience a low growl in his chest. This was a fool's errand, a waste of his time. The Moonstone Alpha was a coward. This would be over quickly. They reached the designated clearing, a circle of ancient standing stones that hummed with old magic. But the clearing was empty. No Moonstone Alpha, no pack, only silence. Yorick said he would be here, one of his guards muttered, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. Before he could move, a scent hit him, acrid and wrong. Not wolf, human, and silver. Without another word, figures melted from the shadows surrounding the clearing. Hunters, at least a dozen of them, armed with crossbows tipped with the gleaming, hateful sheen of silver. A trap. Fury, pure and absolute, erupted in his chest. He let out a roar that shook the very stones around them, a promise of a bloody death to every human who dared stand before him. He launched himself forward, a blur of motion. To make things worse, a new scent cut through the air. Wolfsbane. And it was coming from behind him. He spun around, his claws extending. In that moment, his world tilted. His own guards, his elite blood claws, were not fighting the hunters. They were raising their own weapons against him. At the edge of the clearing, Yorick stepped out from behind a stone, his face a mask of cold triumph. The betrayal was a physical blow, more stunning than any weapon. "Yorick!" Eric's roared, a sound of disbelief and rage. "Your reign of brute force is over, Eric's," Yorick called out, his voice ringing with a power Eric's had never heard from him before. "The packs need a leader who thinks, not just a beast who kills. They need me." Eric's lunged for him, for the traitor, the snake he had harbored at his side. But then came the sting. 1, then 2, then 3 tranquilizer darts embedding themselves in his neck and shoulder. A paralyzing fire spread through his veins, dousing his alpha strength. He staggered, his vision blurring. He fought it, fought the drug, fought the crushing weight of his own guards holding him down with silver-laced chains that burned his skin. The last thing he saw before darkness consumed him was Yorick's face, looming over him with a sneer of victory. And as a heavy, power-suppressing collar was snapped around his neck, Eric's heard his final taunting words. "Don't worry, my king. I'll take good care of your throne. Pain." That was the first thing that clawed its way through the black, suffocating fog. Not the clean pain of a battle wound, but a dirty, grinding ache that settled deep in his bones. Next came the stench, a nauseating mix of unwashed bodies, stale ale, and something metallic and sharp that his mind screamed was silver. He tried to move, to shift, to call on the raging inferno of his alpha power, and found nothing. Only a hollow, terrifying void where his strength should be. His eyes snapped open. Splintered wood filled his vision. He was in a cage, a filthy box barely large enough for his human form, and the jarring, rattling motion meant he was on a wagon. A cage. The thought was so absurd, so utterly impossible, that for a moment he thought it was a fever dream. But then, the cold, heavy weight around his neck pressed into his skin, and the burning reality of the power-suppressing collar ignited a fresh wave of fury. They hadn't just captured him. They had neutered him. He slammed his shoulder against the bars, a useless, desperate act that only sent a jolt of agony through his drugged muscles. Through the gaps, he saw the jeering faces of the human hunters, their teeth yellow in the gloom. They laughed, pointing at him. At him. Eric's, the Alpha King, a sideshow freak for human filth. "Looks like the big dog is awake," one of them cackled. "Not so tough without his magic, is he?" Another sneered. Every word was a spark on a trail of gunpowder. His mind was a maelstrom of promised vengeance, of Yorick's face twisting in a final scream, of tearing these pathetic humans limb from limb. He would get free. He would burn his entire kingdom to the ground to find Yorick. He would... The wagon lurched to a stop. Moments later, the cage door was wrenched open and rough hands grabbed him, hauling him out into the grimy alley of some backwater town. He fought, but his body was a clumsy, leaden thing. They dragged him through a set of heavy wooden doors and into a cavernous, smoke-filled hall. The air was thick with the scent of desperation. And in the center of the room, illuminated by flickering torchlight, was a raised wooden platform. An auction block. The horror that washed over him was colder than any winter in his frozen court. They weren't just transporting him. They were going to sell him. He was shoved toward the stage, his bare feet stumbling on the filth-strewn floor. A short, greasy man with a rat-like face, the auctioneer, grabbed the chain attached to his collar. "And now for our final prize of the evening," the man shouted, his voice grating. "A real beast, this one, caught fresh from the northern wilds." The crowd murmured, their greedy eyes raking over him. He met their gazes one by one, pouring every ounce of his hatred, his promise of a slow and agonizing death, into his stare. He was Eric's. He was a king. He would not be broken. He would not give them the satisfaction of his fear. But deep down, a new and terrifying emotion was taking root. Humiliation. It was a poison more potent than any tranquilizer. "Look at the muscles on this one. A born fighter," the auctioneer crowed, yanking his chain. "What am I bid for this prime specimen?"
The town was a necessary evil. Lyra kept her cloak's hood pulled low, her face in shadow as she navigated the muddy, crowded streets. She hated it here, hated the way the humans stared, their eyes lingering with a mix of fear and curiosity. Because of that, she usually only came for essentials: salt, flour, iron goods she couldn't make herself. Her goal was simple: get in, get her supplies, and get out before anyone looked too closely. But then, she heard the noise. A loud, boisterous crowd spilling out from a dilapidated building she usually avoided. The sign above the door was a crude painting of a broken chain. Curiosity was a luxury she couldn't afford. Yet something, a strange, unsettling energy in the air, pulled her closer. As if pulled by a string, she slipped through the throng of people and into the dimly lit auction hall. And her world tilted. The air was driven from her lungs in a silent gasp. Time stood still. On the stage, chained and bruised, his proud shoulders slumped in a way she never thought possible, was him. Eric's, the Alpha King. The man who had shattered her world with a single, dismissive glance. He was stripped to the waist, his powerful physique marred by dirt and fresh wounds. His golden hair was matted with grime. He looked defeated. A vicious, ugly part of her sang with satisfaction. The universe was balancing its scales. The mighty king who had deemed her worthless was now on display like a piece of meat, his own worth being debated in grimy copper coins. She should have felt joy. She should have turned and walked away, a bitter smile on her lips. Instead, a primal horror coiled in her stomach. An alpha, any alpha, let alone a king, collared and chained by humans was a blasphemy. It was a violation of the natural order of her world, a sight so profoundly wrong it made her wolf pace restlessly beneath her skin. This was not justice, this was a desecration. And then, their eyes locked. For a single, heart-stopping second, across the crowded, smoky room, his golden gaze found hers. There was no recognition, only a raw, burning defiance, a refusal to break. And in that untamed fire, she didn't see the king who had rejected her. She saw a wolf, trapped, caged. And she felt it, etched in fire, a flicker of an impossible, unwelcome empathy. "Sold!" the auctioneer was shouting, pointing to a mountain of a man with a scarred face near the front. "To Brutus the pit fighter! He'll put on a good show before he breaks." Her blood ran cold. She didn't know what scared her more, the thought of Eric's being torn apart in some fighting pit, or the insane, suicidal impulse that was screaming through her veins. Deep down, she knew the truth. Leaving him here to that fate was a cruelty even he didn't deserve. And maybe it was a chance to prove, just to herself, that she was more than the worthless Omega he had named her. Her hand, trembling, closed around the heavy pouch of coins at her belt. Her life savings. Every penny she had earned selling furs and herbs. A quiet life. A safe life. The auctioneer raised his gavel. Going once. Going twice. "Wait!" The word tore from her throat, thin and reedy in the loud hall, but it was enough. The auctioneer paused, his gavel hovering in the air. Every head turned to her. In that moment, she felt the crushing weight of 100 pairs of eyes, just like at the claiming ceremony. But this time was different. This time, she was not the one being judged. Her heart skipped. A beat later, summoning a strength she didn't know she possessed, she pushed her hood back slightly and raised her chin. "I'll double it." A collective gasp went through the crowd. The silence that followed was deafening. The auctioneer's beady eyes widened, a greedy light dawning in them. Brutus the pit fighter turned, a low growl rumbling in his chest as he stared at the slim woman who had dared to challenge him. Lyra's entire body trembled, but she held his gaze. "The little lady has coin!" the auctioneer chirped, his tone shifting from dismissive to delighted. "Do I hear another bid from Brutus?" The pit fighter spat on the floor and shook his head, his eyes promising a later reckoning. He wasn't going to pay that much for sport. "Sold!" the auctioneer shrieked, slamming his gavel down. To the mysterious woman in the back. Her legs felt weak as she pushed her way to the front. Her hands shook so badly she could barely untie the strings of her coin pouch. She poured the contents onto the table. A cascade of silver and copper, the sum total of her solitary existence. For him. For him? The thought was a frantic, repeating echo in her mind. What had she done? The greasy man counted the money, then pushed a smudged bill of sale and the end of a heavy iron chain toward her. "He's all yours, little lady. Try not to get eaten." Her fingers closed around the cold, rough links of the chain. It was heavier than she expected, heavy with the weight of her choice. She walked toward the stage, her gaze fixed on the floor, unable to look at him. She could feel his stare burning into her, a mixture of shock, confusion, and a humiliation so profound it was a tangible force in the air between them. She stopped before him. Her world narrowed to the space of a single breath. Slowly, she lifted her head. He was silent. His jaw was clenched so tightly a muscle jumped. But his eyes were a vortex of golden fury. Without another word, she gave a slight tug on the chain. He didn't resist. He simply rose to his full, imposing height, dwarfing her completely. As she led him out of the auction hall and into the cold, dark alley, the reality of her insane act crashed down on her. Her quiet life was over. Her savings were gone, and she, Lyra, the rejected Omega, was now the sole owner of a collared, dethroned, and undoubtedly murderous Alpha King. Her chest ached. The space between them burned with unspoken history and a terrifying new reality.
A fire. That was the first thing his senses registered. Not the roaring, impersonal blaze of the great hall, but a small, crackling hearth that smelled of pine and something else. Something floral and clean. Herbs. The scent was so jarringly domestic, it felt like a slap in the face. He blinked, his vision clearing, and the full, mortifying picture slammed into him. He was in a cabin, a tiny one-room box made of rough-hewn logs, and he was chained to the wall. The iron cuffs were thick, the chain short, giving him just enough room to sit up on the pile of furs they'd thrown him on. Across the room, bathed in the gentle firelight, was her, the Omega, Lyra. She was moving with a quiet efficiency, tending to a pot over the fire, seemingly oblivious to the caged king in her home. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken history. His fury, which had been a white-hot nova, was now a low, simmering magma of pure humiliation. This chit, this nobody he wouldn't have even glanced at twice. She had bought him. Like livestock. "You," he rasped, his throat raw. His voice, stripped of its alpha command, was a pathetic, broken thing. Still, he tried to infuse it with the authority he no longer possessed. "Release me. Now." She didn't even turn around. "No." The single word, spoken so calmly, so devoid of fear, was more infuriating than any defiance he had ever faced. "Do you have any idea who I am?" he snarled, rattling the chain in a useless display of aggression. At last, she turned. Her eyes, the color of a forest floor after rain, met his without flinching. Her face was pale, but her expression was infuriatingly steady. "I know exactly who you are, Erix. That's the problem." She picked up a wooden bowl from the table. "You were the king who ruled through fear. You were the alpha who believed strength was the only thing that mattered. And you were the man who looked at me like I was dirt beneath your boot." With every heartbeat, his rage grew. Her words were not just an accusation. They were the truth, and hearing them from her was like being flayed alive. "I am still your king, and you will show me the respect I am owed." "Respect?" She gave a short, bitter laugh that echoed in the small space. "You want respect? The men who sold you didn't respect you. Jorik didn't respect you. Truth be told, you're only alive because I chose to buy you instead of letting a pit fighter use you as a chew toy." Her body moved on instinct, her movements precise as she ladled a steaming, fragrant broth into the bowl she held. The smell of the food, rich and savory, hit him then, and his stomach clenched with a hunger so sharp it was a physical pain. He hadn't eaten since before the betrayal, before the world had ended. Without thinking, he watched her every move as she approached him. She was small, unassuming, yet she moved with the confidence of a queen in her own tiny kingdom. The space between them burned. Her scent, wild herbs and clean earth, was a strange counterpoint to the fury churning inside him. She stopped just beyond the reach of his chain. He stared at her, then at the bowl of life-giving broth. It was so close. The steam curled in the air, a fragrant torment. He could almost taste it. He lunged, the chain snapping taut and yanking him back with a brutal jolt. The cuffs dug into his wrists, raw and burning. She didn't even flinch. She simply knelt, placing the bowl on the floorboards an inch beyond his grasp. Her eyes locked with his, and in their depths, he saw not fear, but a cool, unyielding resolve. "You're right," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "You are a king, but this is my home, and in my home, there are rules." She stood, brushing her hands on her trousers. Rule number 1. If you want to eat, you will learn to ask. Nicely.
Her hands were shaking. She turned her back on him, pretending to busy herself with the herbs hanging from the rafters, just so he couldn't see the fine tremor that ran through her fingers. Her heart was a wild bird beating against the cage of her ribs. Every instinct, every fiber of her being that had been conditioned since birth, screamed at her for what she had just done. You do not deny an alpha. You do not challenge a king. But he wasn't a king anymore, was he? And she wasn't just an omega. Not here. In this cabin, the sanctuary she had built with her own 2 hands, she was the one with the power. The thought was both terrifying and intoxicating. For the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of an alpha's judgment, and she let it happen. She could feel his stare on her back, a physical weight, hot and full of hate. The silence roared. She could almost hear the furious thoughts spinning in his head. After what felt like an eternity, she heard a low, guttural sound. Please. The word was a shard of glass, ripped from his throat. It was the most difficult thing he had ever said, and she knew it. A small, grim victory. She turned and slid the bowl into his reach without a word. He devoured the broth like a starving animal, his pride forgotten in the face of raw physical need. As he ate, she allowed herself to truly look at his wounds. The whip marks on his back were angry and red, and the places where the silver chains had touched his skin were blistered and blackened. Without thinking, her training with the pack healers, a skill she had learned long before she ran, took over. She gathered a bowl of clean water, crushed some willow bark for the pain, and mixed a salve of comfrey and yarrow. She approached him cautiously, like one would a wounded wolf. He tensed, a low growl rising in his throat as she knelt beside him. "Stay away from me," he snarled. "These wounds will fester," she said, her voice even. "The silver poisoning needs to be drawn out. Unless you'd rather lose an arm?" He glared at her, his golden eyes narrowed in suspicion. But then his gaze fell to the raw weeping burn on his wrist, and a flicker of something, maybe resignation, passed over his face. He said nothing, but he didn't pull away when she reached for him. Her touch was gentle as she cleaned the wounds on his back. His muscles were corded steel beneath her fingers, knotted with tension and pain. With every dab of the cloth, he flinched, but he remained silent. The air thickened. The simple act of tending to him became something else entirely. It was intimate, dangerous. She was touching the man who embodied her deepest shame, and yet all she felt was a strange, hollow ache in her chest. This close, she could smell him. Not just the grime of his capture, but the scent beneath it. Pine and winter snow and something wild and elemental that was purely him. Her bones remembered him. Her wolf, so long dormant, stirred with a faint, curious pulse. "Why?" he finally asked, his voice low and rough, his face turned away from her. "Why did you buy me?" Her hands stilled for a moment. She didn't have a simple answer. "I don't know," she whispered, and it was the honest truth. Maybe nobody deserves to die in a cage." She finished her work in silence. As she stood to leave, her gaze swept the perimeter of the cabin through the small, grimy window. Just a check. Just a habit. Her breath caught. There, carved into the bark of a birch tree at the edge of the clearing, was a symbol. A coiled serpent with a single watching eye. It wasn't a human symbol. It was a tracker's sigil. A shifter's sigil. They weren't just random bounty hunters who had caught him. These were wolves. Jorik's wolves, and they were already here.
He watched her freeze at the window, her whole body going rigid. The bowl in her hands clattered to the floor, forgotten. A new kind of tension, sharp and immediate, snapped through the air. It wasn't the tension between them anymore. It was the tension of the hunted. "What is it?" he demanded, his voice instinctively dropping to a low growl. She didn't answer at first. She just stared out the window, her knuckles white where she gripped the frame. "We have a problem," she finally said, her voice a strained whisper. A big one. She turned to face him, and for the first time since he'd woken up in this damned cabin, the cool composure on her face was gone, replaced by a stark, chilling fear. Her fear was a scent, a taste in the air that his blunted senses could still register. It should have pleased him, seeing her finally break. Instead, a cold dread snaked its way down his spine. What did you see? A sigil. The serpent's eye, she breathed. Jorik's elite trackers, the Ashhounds. The name hit him like a physical blow. The Ashhounds were legends, silent, relentless, and utterly lethal. They didn't just track you, they became your shadow until they decided it was time for you to die. If they were here, it meant Jorik wasn't just leaving his fate to chance. He wanted Eric's dead, and he wanted it done by the best. Without warning, Lyra sprang into action. She moved with a frantic, desperate energy that was a stark contrast to her earlier calm. She doused the fire, plunging the cabin into near darkness. She grabbed a thick blanket and threw it over the cage of supplies she kept in the corner. They'll be circling, testing the perimeter, she hissed, more to herself than to him. Looking for any sign. She flew to him, her eyes wide in the gloom. We have to hide you. Now. Before he could process what was happening, she was fumbling with a heavy wooden gag. He recoiled, a snarl ripping through him. The indignity of it. Don't fight me on this, Erix, she pleaded, her voice trembling but fierce. One sound from you, one growl, and they'll be on us. They'll kill us both. Do you understand? Her desperation, her genuine terror for both of them, cut through his pride. He understood. He understood that his strength, his roar, his very presence was now a liability. A death sentence. With a clenched jaw, he allowed her to tie the gag in place, the rough cloth scraping against his lips. Next, she pulled at a loose floorboard near the wall where he was chained. Beneath it was a dark, cramped space, a root cellar. The stench of damp earth filled the cabin. It was a hole, a grave. She pointed. Get in. He hesitated. The thought of being trapped in that small, dark space was suffocating. It was the ultimate powerlessness. But then he heard it, a faint, distant howl that was closer than it should be. The sound of the hounds. His survival instinct, raw and primal, overrode everything else. He scrambled into the cellar, the chain clanking loudly in the sudden silence. Lyra quickly covered the opening with the floorboard and a heavy bearskin rug, plunging him into absolute blackness. He was alone, in the dark, gagged and helpless. All he could do was listen. Moments later, he heard the crunch of footsteps outside. The cabin door creaked open. Heavy boots thumped on the floorboards directly above his head. His heart hammered against his ribs. He could hear their low voices, could smell their scent even through the earth and wood. They were wolves, his own kind, hunting him like an animal. Smells like someone lives here, one of them grunted, an omega by the scent, alone. Yorick said the target was bought at the auction, a second voice replied, colder, sharper. Could she have him? This place? A hole like this? Doubtful. The king would have torn it apart by now. Let's check the woods to the west. Leave the omega. She's not worth the trouble. The footsteps moved toward the door. Erix held his breath. It was working. Her scent, her presence, her perceived weakness was their shield. The door closed. The footsteps faded. The silence that followed was absolute. After what felt like an eternity, the floorboard above him was lifted away, and a sliver of gray light cut through the darkness. Lyra was looking down at him, her face a pale oval in the gloom. She untied his gag, her fingers brushing against his skin. As he climbed out of the cellar, he stood before her, breathing heavily. He looked at her, at this small, terrified woman who had just lied to the most dangerous killers in the kingdom to save his life. She hadn't done it with claws or fangs. She had done it with her wits, with a kind of strength he had never bothered to recognize. He opened his mouth to say something, to demand, to command, but no words came out. The look they shared was no longer one of king and subject, or captor and captive. It was something new, something raw and complicated and utterly terrifying. It was the look of two survivors, bound together by a shared enemy and a desperate, unspoken need to stay alive.
The silence in the aftermath was a roaring in her ears. The ash hounds were gone, for now. But the scent of their menace lingered in the tiny cabin, a poison that had seeped into the very wood. This place, her sanctuary, was no longer safe. It had been tainted, marked. Her quiet, hidden life was a shattered ruin. And it was all because of him. She looked at Eric's, who was watching her with an unnerving intensity, his golden eyes sharp and calculating even in his weakened state. The fear that had propelled her was now solidifying into a cold, hard resolve. Hiding was no longer an option. Hiding was just waiting to die. They had to run. "They'll be back," she said, her voice flat. "They know an Omega lives here. They'll come back to question me, and when they do..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. He nodded slowly, the muscles in his jaw tight. "They won't stop. Not until my head is on a spike above Yorick's throne." "Then we have to be smarter than them," she countered, her mind already racing, piecing together a desperate, frantic plan. She was a hunter. She knew this forest better than anyone. She knew its secrets, its hidden paths, its deceptive dead ends. She could use that. They could use that. The word felt strange on her tongue. They. "I can lay a false trail," she began, thinking aloud. "Lead them east, toward the swamps. The scent will hold in the wet ground. It'll be slow, difficult tracking." She looked at him, a new authority hardening her voice. "It will buy us time. But we'll have to move fast and travel north, into the Shadowfell Mountains. It's the last place they'll look." He was silent for a long moment, studying her. She expected him to argue, to scoff, to try and assert some form of command even in his current state. She expected the king. Instead, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. "The swamps are a good idea. But the ash hounds know the standard tricks." He leaned forward, his chains clinking softly, his gaze locked with hers. "When you lay the trail, add a piece of my clothing, something with my scent on it. But douse it in river water first. It will seem like an amateur's mistake to hide the scent, a mistake they'll believe an Omega would make. They will follow it because their pride won't let them believe it's a trap." Her breath caught. It was a brilliant piece of strategy layered with a deep understanding of his enemy's arrogance. And more than that, it was the first time he had spoken to her not as a command, but as a collaboration. He wasn't just giving an order, he was building on her idea. He was treating her like an equal. A fragile, unspoken agreement passed between them, a partnership born of pure, unadulterated desperation. She went to the small chest where she kept her spare clothes and pulled out a worn tunic. Then she looked at the chains on his wrists. "You won't be able to travel far like that," she said. Without a word, he held out his hands. As she worked the crude lock on his shackles with a tool from the hearth, she was keenly aware of his closeness, the warmth radiating from his body, the scent of pine and winter that even the grime couldn't completely hide. The space between them crackled with a new, terrifying energy. The moment the cuffs fell away, he didn't pull back. He just watched her, his expression unreadable, as she tore a strip from the hem of his ruined shirt, the one he had worn as a king.
The forest was a cage of a different kind. Every snapped twig, every rustle of leaves was a potential threat. He moved behind Lyra, his body aching, his senses screaming at him for being so weak, so exposed. But he followed her lead. He watched as she moved through the undergrowth with a grace that was almost supernatural, her steps silent, her path deliberate. She was not the clumsy, fearful creature he remembered from the court. In her element, she was a warrior. They reached the riverbank where she was to set the false trail. The air was heavy and damp. The sound of the rushing water a low growl that set his teeth on edge. As she knelt to soak the piece of his shirt, he scanned the trees, his instincts on high alert. Something felt wrong. The forest was too quiet. The birds had stopped singing. An ambush. So fast. Without warning, a figure dropped from the branches above. A lithe, silent killer in the dark leathers of an ash hound. A flash of silver. A knife, aimed directly at Eric's heart. He was too slow, too weak. He braced for the impact, a curse forming on his lips. But the blow never landed. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. Lyra moved with a speed he would never have believed possible. She lunged, a blur of motion, not away from the danger, but directly into it. She shoved him, hard, sending him stumbling backward, and the silver knife, meant for him, sliced deep into her arm. A strangled cry of pain was torn from her lips. The scent of her blood, rich and vital, bloomed in the air, and something inside him snapped. A rage, so primal and so possessive it eclipsed everything else, erupted from his core. It wasn't the cold fury of a king. It was the hot, mindless fury of a male protecting his mine. The word was a silent roar in his soul. Before the ash hound could strike again, Eric's moved. He didn't have his alpha strength, but he had his size, his weight, and a lifetime of brutal combat experience. He grabbed the chain that had once bound him, whipping it through the air with a vicious crack. It wrapped around the assassin's throat, and with a savage twist, Eric's pulled, cutting off the man's air and sending him crashing to the ground, unconscious. But the world narrowed. The subdued tracker didn't matter. Nothing mattered but her. He scrambled to her side. She was on her knees, clutching her arm, her face pale with shock and pain. Dark blood welled from the gash, staining the sleeve of her tunic and dripping onto the forest floor. He saw the black, angry lines already spreading from the wound. Silver poison. The sight sent a spear of ice through his chest. Lyra. Her name left his lips, a broken, unfamiliar sound. Without thinking, he ripped a thick strip from his own tunic, his hands clumsy in their haste. He knelt before her, his mind a chaotic whirl. She had saved him. This Omega, this woman he had dismissed as nothing, had thrown her body in front of a blade for him. Why? The question was a burning brand on his soul. He wrapped the cloth around her arm, his touch surprisingly gentle, his movements focused. He had to stop the bleeding. He had to slow the poison. The stakes of this desperate game had just changed. It was no longer about his throne. It was no longer about his revenge. In that moment, kneeling in the dirt with her blood on his hands, the only thing in the entire world that mattered was the ragged, shallow beat of her breath.
Pain was a white-hot fire racing up her arm, but it was a distant thing. A vague roaring in the background of her senses. The only thing that felt real was him. Eric's. He was kneeling in front of her, his face a mask of fierce, raw concern. His hands, the hands of a king and a killer, were wrapped around her arm, trying to staunch the flow of blood with a tenderness that was so completely at odds with the man she thought she knew that it made her head spin. Her world tilted. The space between them burned not with animosity, but with a new, terrifying intensity. "We have to move," he said, his voice a low, urgent growl. He scooped her up into his arms as if she weighed nothing. The strength she saw in him now wasn't the arrogant power of an alpha. It was the desperate strength of a man running for his life. For their lives. He found a small, hidden cave set into the side of a rocky outcrop, a place shielded from view by a curtain of ancient ivy. He carried her inside and gently set her down near the back in the cool, earthy darkness. His movements were efficient, his focus absolute. He built a small, smokeless fire with a skill that surprised her, its warmth a small comfort against the chill that was beginning to seep into her bones from the silver poisoning. Then, he turned his attention back to her arm. He unwrapped the makeshift bandage, his expression grim as he examined the wound. The skin around the cut was blackened and swollen. "The poison is spreading," he stated, his voice tight. We have to draw it out." She watched in a daze as he searched the cave. He found nothing. No herbs, no moss, nothing useful. A flicker of frustration crossed his face. He looked at her, then at the wound, and his jaw clenched. Before she could ask what he was doing, he brought her wounded arm to his mouth. Her breath caught. Her heart hammered against her ribs. He pressed his lips to the poisoned gash and began to suck, drawing the tainted blood from her body. The sensation was electric, a shocking intimacy that sent a tremor through her entire being. His focus was absolute. He spat the dark poisoned blood onto the cave floor, then returned to the wound again, and again. The fire in her arm began to subside, replaced by a strange, tingling warmth that had nothing to do with the poison and everything to do with his mouth on her skin. She could feel the slight scrape of his stubble, could hear the low, guttural sounds he made as he worked. This was the most vulnerable she had ever been, and the person tending to her, the person saving her, was the source of her life's greatest pain. The irony was a bitter pill. When he finally pulled away, his lips were stained with her blood. His golden eyes, dark with an emotion she couldn't name, met hers in the flickering firelight. The silence that followed was profound. It was filled with the unspoken weight of what had just happened. The sacrifice, the rescue, the terrifying intimacy of this shared moment. "Why?" His voice was a raw whisper, scraping the stillness of the cave. "Why did you do it? For me?" She stared at him, at the blood on his mouth, at the fierce confusion in his eyes. She didn't have an answer that made sense. Her body had simply moved, a primal, instinctual act she couldn't explain. Her voice trembled. "I don't know." He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before his fingers gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek. His touch was a spark on her cold skin. As if the world narrowed, there was only the two of them, hidden away from the world in a pocket of darkness and firelight, bound by a debt of blood and a fragile, terrifying, and undeniable new reality. The king was gone. And in his place was a man she was beginning to realize she didn't know at all.
The fire crackled, a lone heartbeat in the suffocating silence of the cave. Lyra was asleep, her breathing shallow, her face pale in the flickering light. He sat watching over her, the coppery tang of her blood still a ghost on his tongue. Her sacrifice played over and over in his mind, a searing, impossible image, an Omega, shielding an Alpha King. It was a violation of every law of nature, of every rule his world was built on, and it was the single bravest act he had ever witnessed. Deep down he knew the truth. His strategies, his brute force, his royal fury, they were all useless now. Jorik knew his mind as well as he knew his own. His former beta would anticipate his every move, his every tactical retreat, his every predictable burst of rage. Jorik had built a perfect trap around the king Eryx used to be. But the one thing Jorik could never, ever account for was her. Lyra, his one single, unpredictable variable. She was his only path to survival. More importantly, she was the only thing left in this shattered world he now wanted to protect. The throne felt like a distant, hollow memory, but the thought of the ash hounds getting to her, that was a fire that burned hotter than any ambition. When her eyes finally fluttered open, they were lucid, the fever from the poison having broken. She flinched, expecting him to be gone, or worse, to be angry. Instead, he just watched her, the space between them charged with the unspoken events of the last hour. "The hounds will be sweeping the forests," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "They'll find us." "Not if we find something else first," he said, his voice low and firm. He made a decision. It was a monumental risk, a surrender of his final piece of control. But looking at her, at the quiet strength that had saved his life, it felt like the only sane choice he had left. He had to trust her. He had to trust her because she saw the world in ways he never had. "Jorik thinks he has me cornered," he began, leaning closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. He knows my armies, my patrols, my strongholds, but a king has secrets he doesn't even share with his own shadow. Her eyes widened slightly, her full attention on him. Before my father died, he continued, the words feeling heavy, sacred. He showed me a place, a cache. It was meant for a doomsday scenario, a last resort if the court ever fell. It's hidden, protected by old magic that Jorik knows nothing about. He paused, the weight of his next words settling on him. It holds supplies, gold, and a communication stone that links to a single other stone. One held by an alpha in the south, a man who owed my father his life. Alistair of the Sunstone Pack. He's my last and only hope for an ally. He held her gaze, letting the magnitude of his confession sink in. He was handing her the key to his entire legacy, his final, desperate gambit. Without another word, he knew she understood. This wasn't just about his survival anymore. It was about his trust. Jorik knows my strategies, he finished, his voice raw with a vulnerability he'd never shown another living soul. But he does not know my secrets. In the span of a breath, you've become the only one I can trust with this. His trust was a heavy cloak, settling over her shoulders. It was terrifying. It was validating. It was everything she never knew she wanted. He, Eric's, was placing his life, his last hope, in her hands. The hands of the Omega he had once cast aside. The irony was so profound it ached. "Where is it?" she asked, her voice steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. Following his whispered directions, they moved through the mountains like ghosts. It was a strange, silent partnership. He was still weak, but his knowledge of the terrain was unerring. Yet, he deferred to her instincts, letting her choose the path, letting her senses guide them past the places where the ashhounds might be listening. They moved as one, a silent, symbiotic dance of survival. He led her to a sheer rock face, a place that looked like nothing more than a dead end. But as he pressed his palm against the stone and whispered a single word in the old wolf tongue, a section of the rock shimmered and dissolved, revealing a dark, narrow opening. The air inside was stale, smelling of dust and time. A single glowing crystal on the ceiling cast a pale blue light over the small chamber. And there it was, a heavy iron-banded chest. Inside they found dried rations, medical supplies, a small fortune in gold coins, and nestled in a bed of faded velvet, a smooth black stone that pulsed with a faint internal light. The Echo Stone. "Alistair will be the only one who can hear it," Eric's explained, his voice tight with tension. "The message must be quick and coded." Lyra's fingers trembled as she picked up the stone. It was cool to the touch and it hummed with a low, ancient power. She felt it, etched in fire, a connection to something vast and old. Following Eric's instruction, she focused her thoughts, pouring a simple, coded message into the stone. "The northern crown is broken. The serpent sits the throne. The winter wolf seeks the sun." As the message left her mind, the stone flared with a brilliant, blinding flash of blue light. A wave of pure magical energy pulsed out from the cave, so powerful it made the very air vibrate. A small, triumphant smile touched her lips. It was done. They had a chance. But then, a new sound reached them. It started as a low, mournful note that echoed through the mountains. An answer. But it wasn't the sound of an ally. It was a howl. One howl, then two, then a dozen, all rising in a terrifying chorus that was suddenly, impossibly, close. Her blood ran cold. "What was that?" she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Eric's face was a mask of grim realization. "The stone. It doesn't just send a message. It sends a beacon, a flare of pure energy." He looked at her, his golden eyes dark with a fresh horror. "Jorik couldn't track us before, but now he knows exactly where we are." The howls of the ashhounds answered, closer this time, sharp and hungry. The hunt was on. And they had just rung the dinner bell. Panic was a bitter, metallic taste in his mouth. They were exposed, trapped. He grabbed Lyra's hand, his only thought to run, to get her away, to put as much distance between them and the approaching pack as possible. They scrambled from the cave, plunging back into the cold, unforgiving wilderness. The howls were behind them, a relentless driving beat that spurred them on. This was no longer a chess match. This was a mindless, frantic flight for their lives. They crashed through the undergrowth down a steep, scree-covered slope. His lungs burned. His muscles screamed in protest. Beside him, Lyra was a shadow of grim determination, her face set, her eyes wide as she scanned the terrain for any advantage. But the hounds were faster, stronger. They were the apex predators here, and he and Lyra were just the prey. He heard the whistle first, a high, thin sound that cut through the pounding of his own heart. He glanced back. On the ridge above them, silhouetted against the darkening sky, was an ash hound, a bow drawn taut in its hands. The arrow was aimed directly at Lyra. Time stood still. There was no thought, no strategy, no choice. There was only a single, primal, undeniable command that roared through every fiber of his being. Protect her. As if the world narrowed, he moved. Her body moved on instinct to save him before. Now, it was his turn. Before the archer could release the string, Erix threw himself sideways, his body a shield, covering hers completely. A searing, white-hot agony exploded in his left shoulder. He roared, a sound of pure pain and fury, as the silver-tipped arrow bit deep into his flesh. The impact sent them both tumbling down the slope, a chaotic avalanche of rock and bodies. He twisted, ensuring he took the brunt of the fall, his back and sides scraping against the sharp stones. They came to a crashing halt at the bottom, hidden behind a small outcrop of rock. The pain in his shoulder was a living thing, a fire that was already spreading through his veins. Silver poison. Again. But it didn't matter. He pushed himself up, his vision swimming, and looked down at Lyra. She was staring up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and stunned disbelief. "You," she breathed, her voice trembling. "You took the arrow for me." He ignored the question, his gaze locked on the ridge above. He could hear the hounds scrambling down the slope after them. They had moments, maybe seconds. He grabbed a large, loose boulder with his good arm, and with a guttural roar, heaved it against the unstable rock face. It was enough. The scree shifted, then gave way, and a small rock slide tumbled down, blocking their path and giving them a precious fleeting moment of cover. He slumped back against her, the strength leaving his body in a rush. The world was beginning to blur at the edges. Her small hands came up to press against the wound in his shoulder, a futile, desperate gesture. He looked at her, at the fierce, terrified loyalty in her eyes. He had started this journey to reclaim a crown. But now, bleeding out in the arms of an Omega he had once scorned, he understood. The crown was ash, the throne was stone. Her life was everything. "We have to keep moving," he gasped, his life now depending on her as much as hers had once depended on him. The point of no return had been crossed. There was no king and no Omega. There was only the two of them, against the world.
Every step was a lifetime. She half-dragged, half-carried Erix through the darkening woods, his dead weight a testament to the life draining out of him. The arrow shaft, broken off near his shoulder, was a grotesque stump, and the black veins of silver poison were a creeping map of their doom. His head lolled against her, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. Her muscles screamed, her lungs burned, but she refused to stop. She refused to let him die. Not after he had saved her. "We have to stop," he murmured, his voice a threadbare whisper. "They're too close." "No," she grunted, shifting his weight. "You sent the message. Alistair will come. We just have to make it to the rendezvous point, the old Sunstone Shrine. Deep down, she knew the truth. It was a fool's hope. The Ashhounds were silent now, which was somehow more terrifying. It meant they were no longer chasing. It meant they were closing a net. They stumbled into a small, ruined clearing just as the moon broke through the clouds. In the center stood a single, weathered pillar of white stone. The shrine. They had made it. But they were spent. There was nowhere left to run. Lyra gently lowered Eric's to the ground, his back against the cold stone. His eyes were glassy with fever. "Lyra," he breathed, his hand weakly finding hers. "You have to. Leave me. Go. They only want me." Her heart cracked. "I'm not leaving you," she whispered, her voice fierce. Without warning, the forest around them came alive. Figures melted from the shadows, their forms immense and powerful in the moonlight. But these weren't the dark-clad Ashhounds. These warriors wore armor that glinted like gold, and the sigil on their chests was a radiant sun. Sunstone warriors. And at their lead was a tall, proud alpha with hair the color of wheat and eyes like chips of amber. Alistair. Relief, so potent it almost brought her to her knees, washed through her. "We sent a message," she choked out, holding her hands up. "The winter wolf seeks the sun." Alistair's face was a mask of grim sympathy. He looked at the wounded Eric's, then at her. "You are the Omega," he said, his voice a deep, sorrowful rumble. "You have been through a great ordeal." He took a step forward, his warriors fanning out around them, their presence a comforting wall of strength. For the first time in days, she felt a flicker of hope. A chance. Maybe it was fate that they had made it. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling with relief. "He's been poisoned. Jorik. Jorik has taken the court." "I know," Alistair said softly. "He sent word of the traitor king's escape." The world tilted. Her thoughts spun. What? From behind the ranks of the Sunstone warriors, a new figure emerged, stepping into the moonlight with a slow, deliberate confidence. He wore the black armor of the Alpha King, armor that did not belong to him. His cruel smile was a slash of triumph in the darkness. It was Jorik. In that moment, the trap wasn't just sprung. It was revealed to have been there all along. Alistair hadn't come to save them. He had come to deliver them. The hope she had clung to dissolved into a cold, sickening horror. Her gaze flew to Alistair, but he wouldn't look at her. He just stared at the ground, a portrait of shame. "Hello, little Omega," Jorik purred, his eyes glinting with victory as he took in the scene. Eric's, bleeding and broken at her feet. "You've been quite a problem, but you've also been quite a help." He gestured to Eric's. "Thank you for leading our lost king home."
He drifted in a sea of pain, the world a blurry, incoherent mess. But he heard that voice. Jorik's voice. It was the one sound that could cut through the fever fog, a serpent's hiss that coiled around his soul. With a monumental effort, he forced his eyes to focus. He saw the golden armor of the Sunstone warriors. He saw Alistair's downcast, treacherous face, and he saw Jorik, standing over him like a vulture, savoring his victory. The betrayal was so complete, so absolute. It was almost poetic. His last hope, his father's sworn ally, had been a lie. Jorik. He snarled, the name a curse on his lips. He tried to rise, to fight, to do anything, but his body was a useless prison of flesh and bone. Jorik laughed, a sound that was sharp and ugly in the quiet clearing. Still fighting. Even now, it's pathetic. He knelt, bringing his face close to Eric's. "Don't worry. I won't kill you. Not yet." To make things worse, his smile widened. "I have a much more fitting end in mind for you." He was dragged back to the frozen court. Not as a king, but as a prisoner in chains, paraded through the very gates he had once commanded. The pack members watched, their faces a mixture of fear and pity. His home was now his prison, and every familiar sight was a fresh torment. They threw him in the dungeons, the ice cells, the very same cells he had designed to break the will of his enemies. The cold seeped into him, a final, chilling insult. He was left alone in the freezing, absolute darkness, the only sound the slow, rhythmic drip of melting ice. Hours later, or maybe it was days, the cell door creaked open. Yorick stood there, a torch in his hand, his shadow dancing on the ice-slick walls like a demon. "Comfortable?" Yorick asked, his voice dripping with mock concern. He paced back and forth in front of the bars. "I've been thinking about your legacy, Erix. A king shouldn't just die. His legend should die with him. He needs to be erased." Erix said nothing. He just stared, his hatred a cold, dead weight in his chest. "That's why," Yorick continued, stopping to look directly at him, "I'm going to hold a new ceremony, a claiming ceremony, right here, in the Great Hall, in front of all the packs." He let the words hang in the air. "And our dear, brave Lyra, she will be the one to be claimed." A growl rose in his throat, a sound of pure, helpless fury. "Oh yes," Yorick savored the reaction. "She will stand before the packs, and she will publicly choose her new alpha, me. She will legitimize my rule with her submission. And you will be there, on your knees, collared and chained, to watch the Omega you cast aside become my queen." His eyes gleamed with a sadistic light. "She saved you once, didn't she? Now, she will be the one to condemn you to absolute irrelevance. And then, after she has chosen me, I will have you executed." After Yorick left, the darkness returned. But it was different now. It was heavier. It was absolute. He wasn't just a prisoner anymore. He was a prop in Yorick's final twisted play. And Lyra was the prize, the weapon that would be used to deliver the killing blow to his very soul. He closed his eyes. The physical pain from the arrow wound was a dull, distant throb compared to the agony that was tearing him apart from the inside. He saw it all with a blinding, horrific clarity. His whole life, his entire reign, had been a lie. He had built his kingdom on fear, mistaking it for respect. He had defined strength by the ability to dominate, mistaking it for leadership. His arrogance had blinded him to Yorick's ambition. His cruelty had driven Lyra away, and his desperate, selfish quest to reclaim his throne had only dragged her back into this hell, leading her to capture, to humiliation, and now to a fate worse than death. She would be forced to bond with a monster, all while he was forced to watch. The crown was ash. The throne was a block of ice. His name would be a forgotten whisper. All of it was worthless. Every battle he had won, every rogue he had crushed, every ounce of power he had amassed, it all meant nothing. Because in the end, he had failed to protect the one thing that had shown him the true meaning of strength. The one person who had shown him loyalty when he deserved none. He was responsible for her fate. The weight of that truth was a mountain, crushing the air from his lungs. In the freezing darkness of the dungeon he himself had built, the great Alpha King Erix finally broke. He didn't roar. He didn't fight. He just lay there, the last embers of his defiance extinguished, leaving only the cold, empty darkness of a man who had lost everything that ever mattered. He had lost her, and in doing so, he had lost himself. He closed his eyes, not with defiance, but with a quiet, final resignation, and waited for the end.
They locked her in the highest room of the North Spire, a gilded cage. The dress they forced her into was made of silver silk, cold and heavy against her skin, a mockery of the queen she was supposed to become. Her window overlooked the entire fortress, a beautiful prison of ice and stone. Yorick thought he was breaking her. He was a fool. He had left her alone, confident in his victory. But loneliness was her oldest friend. And in the quiet, she did what she had always done to survive. She listened. She watched. She felt the fear in the court. But this was a different kind of fear from the one Erix had commanded. His had been a cold, awesome terror, like that of a harsh winter, predictable, respected. Jorik's fear was a brittle, rotting thing. She saw it in the way the servants flinched when he passed, the way the guards exchanged nervous, resentful glances behind his back. He ruled not with strength, but with a cruel, unpredictable paranoia. And a paranoid king has cracks in his walls. Her chance came in the form of an old servant woman named Anya, who brought her meals. The woman's hands were gnarled, but her eyes were sharp, filled with a deep, weary sorrow. Lyra saw no love for the new Alpha King in those eyes, only a longing for a time that was gone. One evening, as Anya set down the tray, Lyra spoke, her voice a low, urgent whisper. "He's not a true king, is he?" Anya froze, her back rigid. "One should not speak such things." "Why?" Lyra pressed, her gaze intense. "Because you're afraid of him? Or because you know I'm right?" The tension broke. Anya's shoulders slumped. "The old king was a beast," the old woman whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "But he was our beast. He was strong. This one, he is a snake. He poisons the court from within." That was all Lyra needed. "Then help me," she breathed, her own voice thick with a desperate sincerity. "Help me make things right." That night, Lyra explained her plan. It was a mad, desperate gamble, built on whispers and shadows. She gave the old woman two things. First, a message, a few simple words she was to pass to a handful of guards Anya knew were still loyal to the memory of the old ways. Second, she pressed a small, sturdy hairpin into the servant's hand. "Get this to him," Lyra whispered, her entire being focused on this one impossible request. "In the dungeons. I don't know how, but you must. It's the only way." Anya looked from the pin to Lyra's face, her own eyes wide with terror. But then, a flicker of something long dormant, defiance, kindled in their depths. She nodded once, a sharp, sudden movement. She hid the pin in the folds of her apron and, without another word, slipped from the room, carrying the fate of a kingdom in her pocket.
Darkness, cold, resignation. That was his world now. A timeless, frozen hell where the only thing left to wait for was the final humiliation. He lay on the stone slab, the last of his strength, his will, his very soul, leached out of him by the suffocating despair. He had failed her. That was the only truth left. But then, a sound. A faint, scraping noise near the small food slot at the bottom of his cell door. It was so quiet he thought he'd imagined it. He didn't move. It didn't matter. "My king." The voice was a dry, wavering whisper, barely audible. A gift from the lady in the tower. He lifted his head, his muscles screaming in protest. Something small and dark skittered across the floor, coming to a stop just inches from his hand. It was a chunk of stale bread. Worthless. He almost let his head fall back in disgust. But then, something glinted within the crust. He reached out, his fingers clumsy with cold, and broke the bread apart. A hairpin, black and slender, meant for a woman's hair but forged of strong iron. A key. His heart gave a single, powerful thud. It was a spark. A tiny, impossible spark in the absolute darkness. As if pulled by a string, he sat up, his mind so long clouded by defeat suddenly starting to clear. Another piece of bread was pushed through the slot. Tucked inside was a tiny, tightly rolled piece of parchment. His fingers trembled as he unrolled it. The script was crude, but the words were a fire that leaped into his veins. "The serpent's cage is rotten. I will make a crack. Be the wolf." A sound that was half laugh, half sob escaped his lips. Lyra. She wasn't broken. She wasn't a victim waiting for her fate. She was fighting. From a locked tower with nothing but her wits and her will, she was fighting back. His despair, his self-loathing, it was all burned away in a sudden blinding surge of awe. And beneath the awe, fury. A new kind of fury. Not the cold rage of a king, but the white-hot, focused rage of a man whose queen had just called him to war. His mind, sharp and tactical, roared back to life. A crack. She would create a diversion. He knew this hall better than any living soul. He knew its secret passages, its structural weaknesses, its hidden paths. Her diversion would be chaos, and in that chaos, he would be the wolf. He would be the beast Jorik had always accused him of being, but this time, he wouldn't be fighting for a crown. He would be fighting for her. The sound of heavy boots echoed down the corridor. The guards. They were coming for him, coming to take him to the ceremony. He palmed the hairpin, the metal cool and solid and real against his skin. His knuckles were white. He was not a king on his way to his execution. He was a weapon waiting for its moment to strike.
The doors to the great hall swung open, and the sound of the assembled packs was a low, ominous rumble. Jorik's hand was a vice on her arm, his touch possessive and cold as he led her toward the dais. The room was a sea of faces, of wolves she did not know, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear, curiosity, and contempt. She kept her gaze fixed forward, her heart a cold, hard stone of resolve in her chest. Then she saw him. He was forced to his knees at the foot of the throne, chained and collared, his head bowed. But as she drew closer, he slowly lifted his head. His golden eyes found hers, and the world seemed to fall away. There was no despair in his gaze, no defeat. There was only a silent, burning promise, a promise of blood and fury. And in that single, shared glance, she knew. The message had been delivered. The wolf was awake. Jorik pulled her to his side, raising his hand for silence. His voice boomed through the hall, dripping with arrogance. For too long, the North has been ruled by a beast of mindless rage, a king who valued only brute force. He sneered down at Eric's. Today, that era ends. Today, we begin a new reign, a reign of cunning, of strategy, and of true power. He turned to Lyra, his smile predatory. Let it be known, he proclaimed, his voice ringing with triumph, that the Omega Lyra, rejected by that broken beast, now chooses a true king. She will accept me as her alpha, her mate, and together we will... He never finished the sentence. A deafening groan of tortured metal echoed from above. Every head in the hall snapped upward. The great iron chandelier, the size of a wagon wheel, its dozens of torches blazing, was plummeting from the ceiling. Lyra's diversion. The loyal guards had cut the chain. It crashed into the floor in the center of the hall with a sound like the end of the world. A cataclysm of shattering iron, splintering wood, and exploding fire. The crowd screamed. Panic erupted. Warriors drew their blades, smoke filled the air, and in that single perfect moment of absolute chaos, the ceremony of lies became a battlefield.
Chaos was his new kingdom. Fire and smoke and the clash of steel were the sounds of his coronation. In the single heartbeat the world shifted. Eric's moved. He jammed the hairpin into the crude lock of his shackles, a desperate, fumbling prayer. The metal groaned, and then snapped. Freedom. A jolt of raw, untamed energy surged through him, even with the collar still dampening his true power. Without warning, the loyalist guards Lyra had turned, the ones Jorik had dismissed as insignificant, crashed into the usurper's personal guard. The great hall became a whirlwind of violence. Jorik spun around, his face a mask of pure, murderous rage, his eyes searching for the source of this rebellion. His eyes found Eric's. "You!" Jorik bellowed, drawing a wicked, curved blade. "You will die on your knees!" But Eric's wasn't looking at Jorik. His gaze was locked on Lyra. She was backing away from the fray, her eyes wide, a burning torch in her hand that she had ripped from a wall sconce. She was his priority. She was his only priority. He launched himself forward, grabbing a fallen sword, its weight familiar and deadly in his hand. He met Jorik in the center of the hall, their blades crashing together with a shower of sparks. Jorik was fast, his style built on cunning and precision, a direct contrast to Eric's raw, overwhelming force. You see? Yorick snarled, parrying a heavy blow. This is all you are, a beast, a mindless animal lashing out in a cage. He was trying to bait him, to make him lose control. The old Eryx would have. But the old Eryx was dead, burned to ash in a dungeon of his own making. Instead, he fought with a cold, focused fury, his eyes constantly tracking Lyra, ensuring she was safe. Yorick saw the split in his attention and lunged, his blade slipping past Eryx's guard and slicing a shallow cut across his ribs. To make things worse, another of Yorick's guards was closing in on Lyra. A growl rose in his throat, a sound of pure, helpless rage. But then, Lyra moved. She didn't scream. She didn't run. With a fierce cry, she swung the heavy torch like a club, smashing it into the side of the guard's head. The man crumpled, and in that same motion, she kicked over a large, ornate brazier, sending a wave of hot coals and fire skittering across the stone floor directly into Yorick's path. As if fate demanded it, the distraction was all he needed. Yorick stumbled back, momentarily blinded by the smoke and embers. Eryx surged forward, his sword a blur. He disarmed Yorick with a brutal twist of his blade, sending the usurper's weapon flying. He slammed his fist into Yorick's jaw, then another. He had him, beaten, helpless. In his fury, Yorick grabbed the collar around Eryx's neck, trying to use it as a leash, to choke him. "I still control you," he choked out. But his desperate grip, combined with the magical energy still humming in the air, caused the collar's central locking crystal to overload. It glowed a blinding white, and then shattered. Power, a tidal wave of it. The raw, untamed strength of the Alpha King surged back into him, a fire that threatened to consume everything. The beast roared in his soul, demanding blood, demanding vengeance. Kill him, tear him apart, and he almost did. But then he saw her, Lyra. Standing just a few feet away, her chest heaving, her eyes filled not with fear of him but with a fierce, unwavering faith. She was his anchor. She was his control. He took a deep, shuddering breath, forcing the feral rage back down, chaining the beast with his own will. He looked down at the broken, wheezing Yorick at his feet. He could end him. Right here. The Pax would call it justice, but it would be the justice of the old king. Instead, he simply placed a heavy boot on Yorick's chest, holding him down. Defeated. The fighting stopped. A stunned silence fell over the great hall. Every eye was on him, on the true Alpha King, returned to his power, but he ignored them. He ignored the crown that lay forgotten near the throne. He ignored the whimpering traitor beneath his boot. He took his foot off Yorick's chest, turned his back on his vanquished enemy, and walked toward the only thing in the room that mattered. He walked toward his queen.
The world came back into focus slowly. The ringing in her ears subsided, the smoke began to clear, and through the haze, she saw him walking toward her. He was a terrifying, magnificent sight. His shirt was torn, his body bruised and bleeding, but his power was a physical presence, a storm held in check by the force of his will. He was every inch the king, more so now than ever before. And he was walking. To her. Her breath caught. The entire court, all the assembled Pax, were watching, holding their collective breath. They expected him to ascend the dais, to take his throne, to roar his victory. But he didn't even glance at it. His golden eyes were fixed only on her, and in their depths, she saw an emotion so profound, so raw it made her chest ache. He stopped directly in front of her. For a moment, they just stood there, an island of stillness in the ruined hall. The space between them burned. He was so close she could feel the heat rolling off his skin, could smell the ozone scent of his returned power mixed with the tang of his blood. Without a word, he gently reached out, his large, calloused hands coming up to frame her face. His touch was so tender it felt like a dream. His thumbs brushed away the smudges of soot from her cheeks. He scanned her face, her arms, her body, his gaze searching for any injury. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice a low, rough rumble that was meant for her and her alone. The simple question, after everything they had been through, was her undoing. A single hot tear escaped and traced a path through the grime on her cheek. She could only nod, unable to find her voice. And then he did something that shattered every rule their world had ever known. In front of the silent, watching eyes of every Alpha, Beta, and Omega in the northern packs, he lowered his head. He bowed to her. It wasn't a gesture of submission. It was a gesture of absolute, profound respect. An acknowledgement, a declaration. A gasp rippled through the crowd. She saw the stunned disbelief on the faces of the warriors. She saw the dawning, tearful pride in old Anya's eyes, and she saw the utter shame on Alistair's face as he was held by the loyal guards. Eric's lifted his head, his gaze still locked with hers. He had won back his kingdom. He had reclaimed his power. But in this moment, in this public act of reverence, he was telling the entire world that none of it mattered as much as she did. Her world tilted. The Omega he had once seen as dirt was the one he now honored above all else. In the quiet that followed, a new world was being born, right here, in the ashes of the old one.
Days later, the great hall was clean. The scars on the stone floor had been polished but not erased. They were a reminder. He had requested the presence of the pack leaders. They stood before the dais, their expressions a mixture of awe and uncertainty. Jorik was in the ice cells awaiting a formal trial. Alistair, stripped of his rank, had been sent back to the Sunstone Pack in shame, his life spared but his honor destroyed, a mercy the old Erics would never have shown. Eric stood before them, not on the throne but on the floor, on their level. Lyra was at his side. He held the Alpha crown in his hands, its cold, heavy weight a relic of a life he no longer recognized. For generations, he began, his voice calm and clear, ringing with a new kind of authority. We have believed that strength is the power to command, the power to break others to our will. He looked around the hall, meeting the eyes of each Alpha. I was the strongest of you all, and my strength got me betrayed, collared and sold like an animal. He paused, letting the weight of his admission sink in. I was wrong. Strength is not the power to break, he continued, his gaze finding Lyra's. It is the resilience to endure when you are broken. Strength is not the roar of a king. It is the whisper of a woman who refuses to let hope die in the dark. His voice grew, filled with a passion that came not from pride but from a deep, unshakable conviction. Strength is loyalty. It is trust. It is the courage to shield another, even at the cost of your own life. He held up the crown. This is a symbol of the old way, a symbol of a king who ruled alone. As the silence roared, he turned to Lyra. In front of the entire world, he knelt. He went down on one knee, not as a king, but as a man, before the woman who had remade his soul. Her breath hitched, her hand flying to her mouth. Lyra, he said, his voice thick with an emotion he would never again hide. You were never worthless. It was I who was not worthy to see you. He offered the crown to her, holding it up between them. I don't want to be a king who rules over you. I want to be a wolf who runs beside you. I want to build a new world with you, a world where strength is measured by the heart. He took a deep breath. Be my queen, not my consort, not my mate, my equal, my partner. Rule with me, please. She was crying, silent tears tracing paths of light on her face. And then she smiled, a real, brilliant smile that outshone every torch in the hall. Yes, she whispered. She reached out and placed her hand over his on the crown. Together they rose. He didn't place the crown on his head. He didn't place it on hers. He walked to the throne, the one carved from the heart of a glacier, and set the old crown down upon its seat, leaving it empty. A relic. He turned back to her and took her hand. As they stood before the packs, hand in hand, a new era began. Not with a roar, but with a quiet, unbreakable promise between two souls who had walked through the fire and found a new kind of strength together.